Welcome back, and we now introduce the first of our two Roman authors, Publius Virgilius Maro, or known to us more simply as Virgil, 70 to 19 BC for his dates of birth and death. Before doing the actual introduction, I would like to just explain the convention of the names so that it's clear how this relates to Virgil. So the name Publius is one of about 14 so-called praenomina in Latin, or praenomen in the singular. So a praenomen is a pre-name, and it's basically a common name that somebody would be known by, like Marcus, Lucius, Quintus, Publius, Titus, and most Roman men had these names. So like Mark, for instance, in English, would be an example of such a name, like a first name. So that's Publius. Virgilius is the nomen, and that is the gens name. And the gens is the clan of families that are all interrelated either by blood or by political connection or business or any other type of social connection. So that's Virgilius. And Maro is the cognomen, which is the family name and the name that somebody is known by. That's what the COG means. And sometimes it can be a rather funny nickname. So for instance, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero, it means chickpea, so he's Mr. Chickpea. Gaius Julius Caesar was supposed to be have a very rich head of hair. That's what Caesar means. But Caesar himself was actually blessed with a very nice receding hairline most of his life, and so forth. So sometimes funny things happen with those names. Anyway, this guy is Virgil from our standpoint. And he is the author of Aeneid, and it's to that we now turn in chapter 19 of your Harris-Platzner textbook. I would like you here to pause your video and do three things. First of all, that was three. Please, in your Harris-Platzner textbook, open to page 857, which is in chapter 19. That's the first page of Aeneid. Also, in Sakai, under Resources, please open handout number 4, which is about Virgil, handout number 4 in Resources. And also, please open Dramatis Personae of Aeneid, which will give you the summary list of characters for Aeneid. So please pause your video, open the two documents from Resources, and open to page 857 in Harris-Platzner textbook. Okay, do you have that all set? Okay, excellent. So we're going to begin with the handout. The Dramatis Personae is not something I'm going to discuss here in detail, but it's simply there as a reference for you to keep track of all the names that you encounter in Virgil's Aeneid. Not all of those names actually appear in your textbook because there are major gaps in the text that's given to you. But should you ever go on eventually to read the entirety of Aeneid, you have this a compendium of all the names to help you out. So that's the only reason why I wanted to point out the Dramatis Personae to you. But now please turn to handout number 4 so we can introduce Virgil's bio. So, fortunately, we have quite a bit of information given to us in Roman numeral 1 on page 1 of Virgil. We're very well informed about him. We have his exact birth date of October 15th, 70 BC, up near Mantua, the northern part of Italy, which means that he was born out of the country. It's a curious coincidence, I guess, that there are no actual Roman authors we have surviving born in Rome. All the major authors of importance were all born outside of Rome, somewhere in the countryside of Italy, or even in other parts of the empire altogether. For instance, Seneca was a Spanish author, and Apuleius was a North African author. Terence, the Roman playwright, was Carthaginian originally. So that's how things work. Rome is definitely a city of immigrants. Okay, so Virgil himself, as we said, was born in northern Italy on the country. And he was educated quite nicely up there. He later came on down to Rome. He became familiar with the philosophy called the Epicurean one, which is based on the Greek philosopher Epicurus, and which is celebrated by the Roman poet Lucretius in his poem De Rerum Natura, which is considered to be about a generation or maybe half a generation before Virgil's poetry. De Rerum Natura means on the nature of things, and it describes the concept that all of natural occurrences are non-religious in nature. Instead, they're to be derived specifically from the interactions of material objects, especially the atoms, which are indivisible. We're not sure of the exact derivation of the atomic theory, but we know that it does relate to the studies of the Greek mathematician Democritus, as well as another Greek scientist named Leucippus. And Epicurus picked up that in order to put together the philosophy of pleasure of the mind that is needed in order to have calm and lack of disturbance in one's mind in order to be able to make proper moral decisions. And Lucretius builds that up further in De Rerum Natura. So Virgil apparently interacted with this community down in Naples and became really enamored with it and considered himself an Epicurean for most of his life. And the major change that happened with Virgil historically was in 40 BC. This is given to you in E in Roman numeral 1. And that was during the civil wars between Octavian and the assassins of Caesar, Brutus and Cassius. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Mark Antony and Octavian became reluctant allies to pursue the two assassins, Brutus and Cassius. Eventually, the two were chased down to Greece, ironically following the track of Pompey the Great 6 years earlier, and they were killed also in northern Greece, in Thessaly, in a city called Philippi in 42 BC. And so it was especially that initially brought Octavian and Antony together as close allies, even though eventually they had a falling out. So because Octavian had a lot of veterans whom he had to reward and also settle after retirement, he had to find land for them. There was very little land, of course, in Italy. It's not a very large country. And so Octavian's solution was to rob farmers of their land, including Virgil's father. So his estate was confiscated by the state to be given to the veterans of Octavian. And so that, ironically, is the way that Virgil came into his first encounter with Augustus, Octavian initially, and then Augustus. It's strange that the relationship started this way and ended up becoming so close after a while. In any event, Virgil ended up entering the circle of Maecenas, one of two patrons of the arts whom Augustus had. The other one was Messala, the one who worked with Ovid, the other poet that we'll study in a later video. By that time, Virgil had published his first work called the Eclogues, which were based on the poems of Theocritus from later Greek times. These were essentially idylls, all about the Greek countryside. And the Eclogues were published around 39 to 38 BC and included within it all the hardships of the farmers that were going on because of the politics and the wars of the time, and in particular the confiscations, which I mentioned in Eclogue number 1 and Eclogue number 9. So Augustus seems to have been, I should say Octavian, seems to have been impressed with these poems and invited Virgil to become essentially a poet laureate of the empire to come under the later Emperor Augustus. Okay, so once Virgil became known as a poet, it obviously did quite a bit to enhance his own career. He ended up traveling to Greece and researching his next series of poems called the Georgics. So Virgil at this time also met the poet Horace, and the two of them became very good friends. And Horace mentions Virgil several times in his various works, the Satires, and also Eplogue number 16, which is a parody of Virgil's Eclogue number 4. And Eclogue number 4 is the really famous one that mentions the birth of a child that's supposed to bring peace to the Roman world in general. It was thought later to be a description of the Messiah coming down in Christianity, but of course Christianity did not exist at the time Virgil wrote this. So it's most likely the birth of a child of a politician, Pollio, in 40 BC that's being referred to by Eclogue number 4. Okay, so now the Georgics were published in 29 BC. After Virgil's extensive research over in Greece. And the Georgics, first of all, refer to the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And what they essentially do is to describe farming, which is what the word Georgics refers to, literally working the land out of Greek. So that refers to farming. It apparently was revised after the initial publication in 29 BC because it ended with praise of a particular governor of Egypt named Cornelius Gallus, who then afterwards was disgraced and forced to commit suicide And so because of that, that particular ending had to be changed. Georgix also gives us one of our most impressive descriptions of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and that is in connection with Virgil's description of beekeeping. The matter here is that Aristaeus, the shepherd the satyr who chases Eurydice and causes Eurydice to get stung by the snake, is punished by the death of his bees, which in fact would be pretty fatal for anybody engaged in the art of beekeeping. Virgil himself describes the bee colonies in considerable detail, and it's quite interesting that he calls the head bee Rex, or king, instead of queen, the way we would expect. Obviously, Virgil, as a farmer, knew perfectly well that the bee was female, so he had a reason politically to refer to the head bee as male. And in fact, bees figure prominently in a couple of synonyms that show up, similes, that show up in Virgil's Aeneid. So in fact, Virgil probably knew what he was doing there, even though it seems a bit odd to us that they would refer to a king bee. Okay, so after the publication of Georgix, then Virgil spent the rest of his life through the 20s down to 19 BC working on Aeneid. And Augustus was looking forward to it and kept on nagging Virgil to read it out loud, and sometimes he told him to stop bothering him. And Propertius called Virgil another Iliad, or something greater than the Iliad, is being brought to birth, and Virgil was referred to as another Homer, and so forth. Unfortunately, the Aeneid was never actually finished because Virgil traveled to Greece in 19 BC, actually met Augustus out there. He got sick, and he was taken back in medical condition to Italy, and he arrived back in Brundisium, which is in the southern part of Italy, and there he passed away. So he was buried in Naples, and his tombstone specifically refers to his having carried out different forms of literature, fields and pastures and kings, which refers to pastoral poetry, poetry regarding farming, and then finally epic poetry, which is what Aeneid was all about, celebrating the foundation of Rome, so it appears. And also, of course, he mentions his own birthplace up north, and then the fact that Naples is now the place that is going to hold him dear. Virgil's legacy is quite extensive. There's Dante's Inferno, there's Milton, Paradise Lost, and quite a few other references to Aeneas and Aeneid in different places. And if you have watched the movie Troy, you might know that near the end, as Troy is falling, that Aeneas is seen there very briefly, sneaking away through a tunnel in order to escape from Troy. That's probably not accurate to the original myth, but it's still quite noteworthy to see Aeneas make a cameo appearance in that particular movie. Okay, so that's what we have to say about Virgil's Aeneid. We're going to now devote a separate video to Aeneid itself. So please come on right back, and we will talk about Aeneid.